You know how we all try to make sense of our own lives? We sort of divide them into chapters.
Yeah, like childhood, school years, career, that sort of thing.
Exactly. It helps us see the flow, the changes, the big moments.
Sure, it gives it structure.
But imagine trying to do that for a whole civilization, especially one like Tibet, so ancient, so complex.
Right. Suddenly deciding where one chapter ends and another begins gets, well, really tricky
Mm.
and potentially controversial.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Today, we're doing a deep dive into periodizing Tibetan history, indigenous and Western approaches.
Uh-huh.
Our mission really is to get a handle on how different historians, Tibetan ones, and Western academics have tried to carve up Tibet's huge past into meaningful chunks.
And crucially, why they chose those specific divisions.
Mhm.
What does it tell us about their priority?
That's the key point.
Yeah, what's fascinating here for you, the listener, is that how you define those chapters reveals so much about what you think is important. So we'll be exploring the values, the sort of underlying assumptions that shape these historical frameworks.
So this isn't just about memorizing dates and eras.
Not at all. It's really about seeing how history itself is a story, or maybe multiple stories, told from very different viewpoints, and understanding why those viewpoints matter.
That sets the stage perfectly. So before we jump into Tibet specifically, maybe we should nail down the basics.
Right.
What exactly is periodization? Why is it such a big deal in history, and why does it often spark debate?
Right. Well, simply put, periodization is just the act of dividing the past. You chop it up into distinct blocks of time, these chapters or periods.
Okay.
It's how historians try to make sense of everything, events, patterns, changes over time. It helps highlight what they see as significant shifts or continuities.
But it's not just about dates then.
No, and here's the kicker. This is where it gets really interesting. Any periodization scheme you come up with inherently reflects the value judgments and the priorities of whoever's doing the dividing.
Ah, okay. So it's subjective in a way. It's based on what the historian thinks is most important,
Exactly. It's a choice. It's not just a neutral sorting exercise.
which explains why it's debated.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Because it can always be challenged. Someone else comes along with different values or a different focus, and they'll propose a different way to slice up the timeline.
Right.
And understanding these different lenses, these different ways of dividing time, helps you appreciate just how rich and complex history is. It's not just one fixed timeline to memorize.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so with that framework in mind, let's start with Tibet itself. How have Tibetan historians traditionally viewed their own past? It sounds like there are kind of two main paths they've taken.
That's right. Historically speaking, Tibetan scholars have mostly organized their history in ways that prioritize one of two things: either the story of Buddhism, its spread, its development, or, alternatively, political history, who was in charge, the rise and fall of different powers.
Okay, let's tackle the Buddhist-focused ones first. How do those models picture the flow of history? What are their main chapters?
These approaches really emphasize the transmission, the thread, sometimes the decline of Buddhist teachings. Often they focus heavily on translating scriptures, bringing the Dharma to Tibet.
So religion is the primary engine of history for them.
In these models, yes, very much so. One of the earliest examples is a fourfold model. You find hints of it in texts like the Dunhuang Chronicles, which are quite old, maybe 8th to 10th century.
Wow, okay, so what are the four parts?
It usually starts with the pre-imperial, pre-Buddhist period. This ends around 630 AD.
And how did they view that time?
Interestingly, some traditional accounts kind of frame it as a time before civilization arrived with Buddhism, sometimes describing early Tibetans as savage barbarians. Buddhism is seen as the key civilizing force.
That's a powerful narrative right from the start.
Definitely. Then comes the period of the early spread of the teachings, the Stingadar. That's roughly 630 to 842 AD. This is seen as kicking off with King Srong Butsan Skampo. He's a huge figure, often seen as an emanation of Avalokitesvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. He's credited with really bringing Buddhism into the court.
So the very beginning of their recorded history, in this view, is tied directly to Buddhism's arrival.
Absolutely. It frames everything. After that, there's a period of darkness and chaos. This starts around 842 AD, though the endpoint isn't always clearly defined.
Why darkness and chaos?
This period begins with the persecution of Buddhism under King Langdharma, and then the collapse of the old Tibetan Empire, which had supported Buddhism. So from a religious standpoint, it was a dark time.
Right, a major setback for the institution.
Exactly. And finally, the fourth chapter is the period of the later spread of the teachings, the Phaidar. This starts in the late 10th century and marks a kind of Buddhist revival or renaissance.
Okay, so that's the four-part structure. Are there other Buddhist models?
Yes, there's also a popular threefold model. You see this with scholars like Shamden Rigpe Reldry in the 13th century. It also has an early spread period.
How is it different?
Well, this version sometimes pushes the start date even earlier, sometimes framing it almost miraculously, like Buddhist texts just appearing during King Latotori's reign, maybe way back around 460 AD.
Wow, really emphasizing the ancient, almost faded nature of Buddhism in Tibet.
You got it.
Yeah.
It continues through those famous kings like Strong Butsan Scampo and Khosrow IDBD San. Then it has a period of the interim spread.
Interim, what does that cover?
This bit highlights the translation work of key figures, like the great translator Loken Rinchen Bezampo, often associated with King Yishas in Western Tibet. It bridges the gap.
Okay.
And then finally, the later spread, which is linked to a whole new wave of translators, like Drachmi Lotsawa.
I see. And you mentioned a twofold model, too.
Yeah, some later scholars like Sakya Drapa Galtsen or Bhutan kind of condensed it. They basically have the early spread ending around 842 and the later spread starting late 10th century with that dark age in between, though its dates are often a bit fuzzy.
So these Buddhist models, they provide a really strong religious narrative arc.
They do. But, the criticism sometimes leveled at them is that they might overemphasize the religious doctrine side of things.
Right.
And maybe, as a result, they simplify the very complex social and political stuff happening at the same time.
That makes sense. If religion is your main lens, other factors might fade into the background.
Exactly.
So if those models face that criticism, how did the historians focusing more on politics divide things up? What did their chapters look like?
Okay, so these political approaches, they look at history through the lens of power. Who held it? Where was it centered? How did it consolidate, fragment, and then maybe consolidate again?
So based on ruling powers or dynasties.
Is essentially yes.
Yeah.
Or specific regional hegemonies. A really interesting example is Guru Trashi's scheme from the 19th century. It's incredibly detailed.
Pretty well.
He breaks down the history of central Tibet into maybe 11 distinct periods, each one defined by a specific, consolidated center of power.
11. Wow. Give us an example.
Sure. He talks about the period of the early kings, centered way back in the Yarlung Valley. That's distinct from, say, the much later Sakya period, when power was based at the Sakya monastery and had links stretching all the way to the Mongol court.
Okay, so very specific power bases define the eras.
Exactly. And then later, you get the period of Desi Sonamrapten and Gushri Tenzin Chogyal and the Ganden Podrang. That's the government established by the fifth Dalai Lama. He maps out all these shifts, like power moving from the Rinpong family to the Zangpa rulers and so on. The focus is always on that axis of power.
Fascinating. Any other major political schemes?
Yeah, another really compelling one comes from Dunkar Lozang Trenlay, writing in the early 1980s. What's notable here is the explicit influence of Marxist thought.
Marxist. How does that apply to Tibetan history?
He uses it to trace the development of what he calls the Tibetan politico-religious system. He divides history into big stages. First, the pre-establishment of the Tibetan politico-religious institution.
Okay, what falls into that stage?
That covers everything, from the pre-Buddhist era, sometimes called the period of Bon, that's the indigenous tradition, through the Buddhist imperial period, the subsequent period of chaos or fragmentation after the empire fell, and then the period when Buddhism started reviving again.
So his Marxist lens focuses on the system itself, how the relationship between politics and religion developed, rather than just who was king or which Buddhist school was prominent.
Precisely. It's looking at the structure of society and power. Then his second major stage is the establishment of the Tibetan politico-religious institution.
And what does that cover?
This is where you see the rise of these powerful ruling entities, often based around monasteries, but involving noble families too, like the Sakya, the Pakmodru, the Sanpa rulers, leading right up to the period of the Ganden Podrang, the era of the Dalai Lama's government.
Right.
And his later periods then track things like the decline of that system's independence, encroachment by outside powers, and ultimately the period following the arrival of the Chinese PLA.
That's a very different way of framing things.
It is. And then there's Thupten Punsak, writing in the 90s. He offers an even broader approach, dividing history into 9 periods based not just on politics, but also major religious shifts, intellectual developments, socioeconomic changes, even scientific stuff. A wider lens again.
Wow. Okay, so within Tibet itself, there's this incredible diversity of ways to periodize the past, depending on whether you prioritize religion, politics, social structures.
Absolutely. It shows there wasn't just one accepted timeline.
So let's switch perspectives now. How did Western scholars tackle this? Did they bring completely different ideas, or did they kind of build on these indigenous models?
Well, many of the early Western scholars tended to apply historical categories they were familiar with, often ones derived from European history.
Ah, okay. Like what?
Well, think of Giuseppe Tucci, a major figure writing in 1949. He divided history into chunks like Central Tibet from the fall of the dynasty to the Mongol invasion, or the Sakyapa period. You can see the focus on political shifts there. Or R.A. Stein in 1962, proposing periods like the ancient monarchy, the evolution of monastic power, and the modern era.
Ancient, modern. Those sound very European.
Exactly. Or Snellgrove and Richardson in 68 used the early kings, then the Middle Ages, covering monastic foundations, Mongol influence, independence, and then the Yellow Hats, meaning the Gallic school's rise, followed by Manchu overlordship, British involvement, and communist rule.
Middle Ages for Tibet.
Right. And Helmut Hoffman in the 90s also used terms like pre and early history, the rise of the Tibetan Empire, a dark period followed by medieval periods like the second introduction of Buddhism and the development of the theocratic state.
So it seems a lot of these early Western models borrowed heavily from European historical stages. Did that actually work well for Tibet? Did it fit the context?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And many later scholars, like Bryan Cuevas, for instance, have argued that maybe these categories, ancient, medieval, modern, don't actually provide the most meaningful structure for Tibetan history.
Why not?
Think about it. In some of those schemes, the medieval period for Tibet could stretch for over 1,000 years.
Wow, yeah, that's a huge, probably very diverse span of time to label with one term.
Exactly. It risks lumping together very different eras. These Western terms can sometimes impose an external framework that doesn't quite capture the unique dynamics of Tibetan culture, religion, and politics, or align with how Tibetans themselves might see their past.
It's like forcing it into a pre-made box that doesn't quite fit.
Sort of, yeah.
So what came next? Are there more recent Western academic approaches that try to be more sensitive to the Tibetan context, avoiding those potentially ill-fitting labels?
Yes, definitely. Bryan Cuevas' own model, proposed in 2006 specifically for Central Tibet, is a really insightful example. It tries to move past those Eurocentric terms and focus instead on major internal shifts in power and social organization within Tibet.
Okay, how does he divide it up?
He suggests 4 main ages. First is the Imperial Age, running roughly from before 610 up to about 910 AD.
What defines that age?
This covers the rise and height of the Tibetan Empire, often called the Yarlung dynasty, starting with key figures like King Strong-Buksin Skampo in the 7th century. This is when you see a recognizable Tibetan state forming, a written language emerging, laws being codified. Tibet becomes a major power in Central Asia. Unification and expansion, basically.
Right, the classic empire phase. What happens after it collapses?
That leads to his second age,
Yeah.
the Age of Fragmentation. This runs from about 910 to 1249 AD. It follows the empire's breakdown, especially after King Glangdharma's anti-Buddhist actions in the mid-9th century.
So politically fragmented.
Exactly.
Right.
There are no central state archives from this time in central Tibet. Power is scattered among local rulers, warlords, and importantly, emerging monastic centers that start acting like principalities. Central authority is gone.
A period of disunity. Then what?
Then comes the age of monastic hegemony, lasting from about 1249 to 1705 AD.
Monastic hegemony. So the monasteries become the dominant power.
Increasingly, yes. This age is defined by the rise of powerful monastic institutions, often led by aristocratic families associated with them. Crucially, they often relied on outside patrons like the Mongols, later others, for military and financial backing to exert control.
Ah, so it wasn't just internal power, but alliances too.
Very much so. This age includes distinct periods within it, reflecting which major monastic school or associated power held sway.
Like what?
You have the Sakya period first, marked by Mongol overlordship, after the Sakya Pandita was granted authority over Tibet's regions by the Mongol rulers around 1247.
Okay.
Then, after a rebellion against Sakya rule, you get the Nudong period with the Pakmadrupa hegemony. Later comes the Zigatse period associated with the Karmapa hegemony.
Different monastic schools vying for control, essentially.
And finally, the Lhasa period with the Gentempa hegemony. This is the system really solidified under the great fifth Dalai Lama and his regent, Singye Gyatso, in the 17th century. That's often described as the classic Tibetan religio-political system.
A fascinating period where religious institutions wielded immense political power, often with external backing. What's the final age in Cuevas's model?
His last major division is the age of foreign interests and occupation, starting around 1705 and running right up to the present day.
Okay, the title speaks for itself there.
Pretty much. It marks the beginning of much more direct involvement and interference by outside powers in Tibetan affairs.
Who are these foreign interests?
It includes periods of Kossuth Mongol rule, then a brief but disruptive Dzungar Mongol occupation, then, crucially, the establishment of the Manchu Protectorate, where the Qing dynasty asserted control alongside the continued Gelugpa dominance. This is when China really established a direct military political presence in Lhasa, setting up the Amban Residency in 1728.
Right, a major shift.
Huge. Then the model includes the period of growing British interest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, followed by a period of de facto Tibetan independence after the fall of the Qing dynasty, from about 1914 to 1951. And finally, the period of Chinese communist occupation from 1951 onwards.
So Cuevas' model really tries to map the major structural shifts in power and governance within Tibet, moving away from those potentially misleading European terms.
That seems to be the goal, yeah, focusing on Tibetan dynamics.
Okay. We've looked at this incredible variety in Buddhist narratives, political power shifts from Tibetan perspectives, Western attempts to apply familiar categories, and more recent efforts to find Tibet-centric frameworks. It's clear periodizing isn't simple.
Not at all.
So, stepping back and looking at the big picture, what does all this tell us about Tibetan history, writing, historiography itself? And what are maybe the biggest ongoing challenges for anyone trying to understand Tibet's past?
Yeah, this is where we kind of synthesize it all.
Yeah.
One really crucial takeaway, especially regarding the older Tibetan sources, is recognizing potential bias, particularly the Buddhist historical accounts. They often served a purpose beyond just recording facts. They work to legitimize Buddhist institutions, Buddhist lineages, and specific leaders. Historical figures might be actively reinterpreted, presented as ideal Buddhist rulers, even if the reality was more complex. This helps solidify the authority of Buddhism and its representatives.
So modern historians have to read those sources critically.
Absolutely. You have to acknowledge the inherent biases, the sometimes idealized stories, especially around things like initial conversions to Buddhism. It doesn't mean the sources aren't valuable, but you need that critical lens.
What about the very earliest records? Are they different?
Yes, significantly. Something like the Old Tibetan Annals, which is the oldest actual history we have from Tibet, is very different in style.
How so?
It's much more laconic.
Yeah.
Bureaucratic records, just short entries noting key events, appointments, battles, deaths, diplomatic missions.
So more factual, less narrative.
Exactly. It gives a reliable but quite minimalist skeleton of events. It's a stark contrast to the elaborate, religiously infused narratives written centuries later. Reconciling those different types of sources is a major task for historians.
I can imagine. What other major themes emerge?
Well, the intertwining of religion and politics is just constant. It's unavoidable in Tibetan history.
How does that relationship change over time?
It evolves. You could argue there's maybe more separation between secular and religious power in the early imperial period, but later on, you see periods where they merge much more closely, sometimes even under the exact same leadership, like with the Dalai Lamas and the Ganden Padrang government. Understanding that dynamic is key to understanding almost any period.
And does the sheer diversity of Tibet itself pose a challenge?
Hugely. This comes back to that question.
Yeah.
What does Tibetan even mean historically?
Yeah.
Tibet isn't monolithic. You have vast, distinct regions like Kham and Amdo in the east, Ladakh in the west.
Right.
These regions often had very different histories, different relationships with the central government in Lhasa, sometimes very little control exerted from Lhasa.
So creating one single periodization for Tibet might not satisfy people in those regions.
Exactly. It's incredibly difficult to create a single timeline that feels accurate and relevant to all these diverse regional perspectives and experiences. That remains a significant challenge.
So bringing this all together, what's the main takeaway for us? We've seen that how you periodize history, how you chop it up, isn't just some neutral academic exercise.
Not at all.
It's fundamentally about making choices. It's about highlighting what you or the culture you're in believe is most significant. It reflects the values and concerns of the time the history is being written.
Precisely. And for you, the listener, grappling with these different periodization schemes is really valuable. It helps you see that history isn't just one fixed story, one set of dates passed down unchanged.
Yeah.
It's much more like a complex tapestry woven with different threads. Each thread, each periodization scheme tells a slightly different story, emphasizes different patterns, but each can be valid from its own perspective.
It encourages a more critical look at any historical narrative.
Exactly. So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Next time you come across any historical timeline, whether it's about Tibet or anywhere else, just pause for a second.
Hmm.
Ask yourself, whose story is this timeline telling? What values does it seem to be based on? What might it be leaving out or downplaying?
Right.
And maybe even think, could you divide this same history differently? What other chapters could you create that might reveal different insights or emphasize different turning points that this particular timeline overlooks?